So today we'll be covering professional agreements in Unifier. As you may have seen from the training session sign up and the emails, the budget and funding training was a prerequisite for this course, and that's to make sure that your training project, if you're following along in your training project, has sufficient budget and funding in the proper cost codes in order to process an agreement. Otherwise, we will get stuck when we try to enter the agreement because you won't have sufficient funding. And then at the end, it's going to make sure that we've got sufficient funding and budget in each individual cost code. So a reminder, before you enter agreements or amendments, it's always a good thing just to double check your cost sheet to see where your budget and funding is at. So if I go to budget and funding management and cost sheet, I'm going to pull up my cost sheet in my training project here, just so we can make sure we've got enough funds to execute this agreement. Open up my project cost sheet. And then the first thing I like to do once the cost sheet is open is just hit that little, almost looks like a do not enter sign, but it will collapse all of the groupings of the cost codes. So I can see my total allocated funding is 1 million. And my current budget is 1 million. Columns D and E represent my baseline budget, and then any approved changes to the baseline. We had moved in a previous training 20,000 from project contingency to construction. But today we'll be looking at entering a consultant agreement as well as a design agreement for design bid build. So under professional services, I'm just going to go ahead and open up my professional services and take a look at my AE services, which is split out into just a roll-up fee or divided in between the design bid build and the CMGC. All of our training projects are design bid build, and so that's why we put all of our money in the design bid build AE fee. And it looks like I've got amounts for each of the design phases already entered, ranging from 5,000 to 30,000. And then also I see under site surveys, investigations, reports, we've got some money in for an industrial hygienist and materials testing. So maybe when we enter our consultant agreement, we'll use those. Okay, so again, I'm just making sure my project has sufficient budget and funding in those cost codes before I enter the agreement. Otherwise, we're gonna get stuck. The other thing you'll want to check too is in your funding requests. What we've noticed is folks will get their funding request back and they will do the cost code allocation, which allocates the funding to the cost codes. But sometimes they miss that very last step where we tell the funding request that we've done the allocation. So you'll want to make sure that any of your funding requests have a status of allocated. And what that does is this allows the system to double check that you have allocated the same amount in total of funding as you have in approved funding requests. Okay, we're going to process 2 professional agreements this morning in the hour that we have. One is a consultant agreement, which has a fairly short and straightforward form and workflow, and then we'll do an SC 5.1. So you can find all of the agreements under contract and procurement management in your project. So I'm going to go ahead and expand that. I'll see construction agreements and invoicing along with professional agreements and invoicing. I'm going to click on professional agreements. I haven't entered any yet in my project, so my list of professional agreements is empty. If I go up to create, I should have 2 options. One is the 5.3 for the consultant. One is the 5.1 for the design bid build. Now, before we create, let's just do a quick overview of the workflow. Let me pull up the workflow diagram for that. So we are in professional agreements. Let's start with the consultant agreement. Okay. So this is created by the PM or the planner. Currently have permissions to create the consultant agreement. They'll fill in information and then send it forward to the project coordinator to obtain signatures and the purchase order. And so that will be creating the 5.3 and routing it through DocuSign for signature, as well as getting the purchase order from Marketplace. Once those 2 things are done, you can complete this step in Unifier, which is just attaching the signed completed document and purchase order and validating that you have. If there's any issues or for whatever reason the consultant agreement is declined during the DocuSign processing, there is the decline option, which will send it back to the creator for any revisions. Otherwise, if it's all signed and properly executed, you'll select notify vendor. Vendors aren't in the system currently, but once they are, they will get a notification that their agreement is in. Otherwise, it closes that agreement with the status of approved. And now just I'm going to pull up the 5.1 as that's loading. In your training projects, everybody's been set up as the PM, the PC, and the planner so that you can go through the full workflow. I'll point out as we go through the workflow when I'm wearing a different hat. And we've had the design bid build template applied to your training projects. So currently that's still an email template request out to have that applied to your projects. We've already done that in your training project, so you have the workflow available. For the 5.1, and let me just, on my other screen here, make sure I've got the workflow assignments pulled up so I can give you the current assignments for each step. For the 5.1, this too is the PM or planner who will be creating this. The difference here is we have a new step called define obligation to pay. The most of this was around the need for the condition precedent clause, because we're going to enter in the full compensation, but then we're going to separately define what we're actually obligating to pay based on current funding. So in many situations, those will be the same, but in some situations where condition precedent clause applies, you may only be funding the first two design phases. And then until you get additional funding, you'll be adding those additional phases later through an amendment. So the PM or planner creates, they'll send it to themselves for this define obligation to pay. And what that does is based on what you indicate as included or excluded, it will automatically create the line items for you with the cost codes. So it's saving you a little bit of entry. And we just need to put in the amounts for each of the phases. This is then sent to the project coordinator, who will get a task to, again, route through DocuSign for signatures and attach, or go to Marketplace, get the purchase order and attach. Again, if there's a need to decline, there is a revision step. But here, as well as in the consultant agreement, there are certain required fields when we get to this step, and I'll point it out as we route a record through, that you'll have to answer, even if you're going to decline that might not make sense, like date of the controller signature, and then validating that you've attached the document, and the only option is yes. And what you'll do is just go ahead and fill those out anyway, as if it was done, because when you select decline and send it, those fields are going to reset. So it's just kind of a system requirement there. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go back to my training project under professional agreements. When I click create, I have two options. If you don't have two options, that means that you haven't had a contracting method applied to your project. Again, for all the training projects, we've already done this. But in production, if you click create and you're immediately presented with a form, the only workflow that's preloaded in all projects is the consultant agreement. So if you need access to the 5.1, you'll have to do that email request to have the design bid build workflows applied to your project. So I'm going to go ahead and click consultant. The form is fairly short. We're just going to select our consultant name. All right, I'm just going to quick pause the share here. We're getting a lot of activity in chat, and I want to make sure that we don't get too lost on that. So sorry, Catherine, I don't know if...
Yeah, I can't keep up with everyone's conversations, and I worry that all the chat is distracting you from watching the training. So for a purchase order, we realize we're not quite 100% perfect on that create and move it process, but the PM will create it because they know the cost code allocation. We've had a lot of trouble with the project coordinators not picking the right cost code allocation. So it makes sense since the PM, the project managers or planners know that they create it. What it did to the workflow, because that one's really simple, is it asked for the PO number right away. And we realized we can just put TBD in that PO number. Oh, let me turn my video on. And just put in bogus dates. And then it'll go to the project coordinator as their task to go get the actual PO. They know the dollar value. Then when it comes in, they can enter the real number, attach the real PO, and that workflow is done. For a professional agreement, it is created by the project manager or planner, again, for the very reason of attaching those costs to the right cost code line items. It then goes to the PC as a task to obtain signatures, which means they will now do their work with the Meridian template, route that document through DocuSign, and it comes back executed. They obtain their purchase order through Marketplace. They put those two documents together in one file and attach it, and then finish the professional agreement task. Any questions on that?
Yeah, I have some. So we're creating the PO in Unifier instead of Marketplace, or we're doing both?
No, there's no creation of a PO document in Unifier.
So why
we're having a PO process because we need to account for the cost of that PO in Unifier, but you're still creating your PO document in Marketplace. This is allocating that cost the way we allocate it to a work order in Famous.
Okay, and then, so.
I'll get to you, Jess.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dina. I just want to let Jess know I saw her hand.
So the PM creates the, but okay, when you said that we're not printing anything yet, like I don't understand how something gets from Unifier out of Unifier into DocuSign.
It doesn't leave Unifier to DocuSign at this point. So for a purchase order, we're issuing just a purchase order. We create a purchase order business process in Unifier. That's what the PM's doing, so they can tie that work to a cost code. Then it goes to the project coordinator to make the request to Marketplace for the actual purchase order document, which they will then attach to the business process in Unifier. For agreements and modifications, the business process gets created, the cost code stuff is done, and then it goes to the project coordinator to then create the document from the Meridian templates, route it through DocuSign, and then attach back into the Unifier business process.
Okay, so what we're going over here is not creating anything except a step, a business process.
Right, we're doing the business process in Unifier.
But there's other, okay.
Okay, Jess? I can't hear you. Not yet. Nope, can't hear you. Still, no. Oh, I hear some noise from somebody. Nope, not you, Jess. Sorry. Dina, you had another question?
So the PC actually does the whole agreement like we normally do, create the PO, and then that's when we put it back into Unifier.
Correct.
Yes.
Eric, Dina might have, when she muted herself, I think you have to release her again.
Yep.
There you go. Dina, you should be.
I was
be
going to
unmuted.
tell Jess to check her settings on, I was trying to tell her, but
Audio.
whatever.
Yeah, I think she's rejoining now.
Just check your settings to allow your device. This happens to me all the time.
Okay. She's giving us the go ahead to move on.
Oh. Call me later, Jess.
Okay.
We're not changing the creation of the agreements. We're just attaching them to the business process in Unifier. And Unifier will auto copy accounting. Jess asked about purchase order for construction. So a purchase order could be issued to anybody. It's always listed in the business processes under construction agreements. So if you're writing a PO for under 150,000 for construction, it's just located under construction agreements. If you're issuing a PO to buy a piece of equipment, it's listed under construction agreements. If you're doing a PO to Jim Woolham for services, it's listed under construction agreements. It just was a matching business flow. So we apologize for the naming.
One last question. So in this training, are you going to show us how to attach a PO or an agreement into Unifier?
Yes, Eric will just grab a document and click it on attachments.
Oh, okay. So different than uploading into document management, which we
Correct.
Okay.
So that's a really good point. Thanks, Dina. When we attach a document into a business process via attachments, like you can see on the screen now, it will auto-file it into the document manager.
And that's currently happening already?
It currently happens already. I'm actually almost fine, was almost ready to send out. We need to do a little cleanup between Meridian and Unifier. And so I was just clarifying the directions on that so people don't overdo stuff in Unifier. But if you've already entered an agreement in Unifier, but you had also saved it to Meridian, we're going to ask you to remove it out of Meridian. Because when the Unifier uploads to Meridian, we'll have duplicates. But I'm working on very clear directions to make that simple.
And so we still create agreements using the templates in Meridian.
Correct.
Store them in there. But then you're saying when we attach it to the business process, we have to go back into Meridian and take it out?
Well, you don't want to save the signed executed copy into Meridian.
Okay.
Because you're attaching it to the business process.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. We've still got a lot to get through here. So let's keep pushing along. So I've got the consultant agreement form open in Unifier. Of course, this is meant to be the information that will populate the agreement. This is not the agreement itself. If you're ever confused or concerned about which agreement you're creating, always check the top. So it's telling us we're doing a 5.3 consultant agreement. So we'll search for our vendor. And we can type for the vendor here to search, or again, use our picker button to pull up the full list. Now the vendors are preloaded into Unifier. If anyone's missing, there's an email request that I believe goes to Lori and Christine to add those vendors. All right, so I'm just going to select a vendor here, but again, there's always a find on page if you're looking for somebody specific, and you can search on any of the columns. Highlight your vendor and click select. This will populate the vendor information, including address, city, zip, etc. We also need a contact name. This isn't necessarily the person signing the agreement. This is just the main contact for the contract. So I'm just going to go ahead and put in myself. You will note that there's a little firm contact name up here with a picker. This is for use once we have the vendors as users in the system. You can actually just select that person and it will populate their information. But until then, we have to manually enter their name, title, and email. Next is the purpose of the contract. And this is mostly for noting the purpose of the contract. This doesn't appear in the agreement form. Basis of compensation, amount written. So this is the amount of the agreement. You'll notice the compensation below is gray. We can't enter a dollar amount. We're going to do that using the cost line items tab when we're done. But in this case, this is going to be 1,000 and we don't have to write dollars. As Catherine mentioned, currently we're actually creating the SC 5.3 agreement from the Meridian template outside of Unifier, and that's because the custom prints that Unifier will generate haven't been updated to reflect the latest OS 8 changes. So. Speed type will auto-populate from your project information based on what was entered either when the project was created or based on what was updated with the last approved funding request. So if Fund 71 was created or if there are multiple speed types, so long as that funding request got fully processed, that information will be up to date and shown here, but it is editable if you need to make changes. Just note that this does not actually change any of your speed types in the funding request. If you change it here, this is just the speed type that's noted for this agreement. So if there is a mismatch, you'll want to make sure that you get your funding requests updated to make sure your funding is coming from the correct speed type. Firm's proposal date. I'm just going to select this as a date in the past. And then the principal representative will default to Ron Reed, but if you need to change it, Mark and David King are available for certain situations. Okay, next step is cost line items. So we'll go to the cost line items tab, which again is a line item form, which allows us to enter multiple line items. In this case, we're only going to add one. Now, short description is listed first, and I can put in materials testing. However, the next field is the cost code. So if I select that picker and search for my cost code, that's also going to populate a name that you could copy and paste as well if you didn't want to type it. So again, I'm going to use that find on page, which just creates a little search bar at the top. And if I go to materials, I can see materials testing here under professional services. I'm going to select that. And that populates the code name. So of course, if I hadn't already typed my short description, I could just, Control C and Control V to copy and paste if I wanted to save myself. Some typing. The amount, we're going to put in 1,000. And then we're going to go ahead and click save. If I go back to the form and I scroll down to basis of compensation, now we'll see our compensation is 1,000. So it's good to double check that, or you could also add your cost line item first and then come back here and then use that as a reference to enter your written version of that. Okay, so this is me as the PM or planner. I'm going to go ahead and click send, which is going to send this to the project coordinator, which in this project and in your projects will be yourself. So we're sending for obligation or obtain signatures PO to project coordinators. You may have multiple folks in your project coordinators group in training. That's fine. In your projects in production, you're only going to have one person in that project coordinators group. Go ahead and click send, and now we'll see our agreement in the log once we click OK with the status of pending. So now the project coordinator gets a task for that obtain signatures and PO step. So if I go to my task manager, I'll now have a task for professional agreements sent for obtain signatures and PO. I'll double click to open that up. Again, as the project coordinator. So now I've got the cost code information. I've got a lot of the information I need to go ahead and populate the 5.3 agreement from the template in Meridian, and then route that through DocuSign for signature. And then also get the PO from Marketplace. Because this, you won't really be completing this step until after that's done. But this task will give you a lot of that information that you need. So once those two things are done outside of Unifier, if you hadn't already, you would then accept the task and then attach that signed 5.3 that was routed through DocuSign, as well as the purchase order that was created in Marketplace. So to do that, we'll just come here to the Attachments tab. There's a little down arrow next to the paperclip, and we can click Browse to search our local machine. That's Document Manager. Again, this is if you're going to attach something that's already in the Document Manager. Most times you're just going to be using the Browse. With this, you've got two options. You can click Browse to bring up a file explorer. I'll just go ahead and click that to show you. Or you could navigate to wherever on your desktop or machine or a network location like Meridian to find the appropriate document to attach. Or I'm going to close this. You can also drag and drop if you've already got just a file explorer window open. So we're going to pretend this is my signed agreement and PO. I'm selecting both of them. I can just drag them over and drop them, multiple files at once, and then click upload. Don't need to change anything else. Once I've done that, they show here in my list of attachments under the tab. Then there's 3 required fields to fill out. So data controller signature. This won't let you it won't allow you to select a future date. I'm just going to go ahead and select today. The purchase order number. and then have you signed the completed document? Have you attached the signed completed document? Yes. Now let's say as it routed through DocuSign, it got declined, and now we need the creator, the PM, or the planner to make changes to this information. We still have to put in this information here. We would just hit select today as the controller signature, put TBD and the PO number, and then just go ahead and hit yes. You won't attach anything, but when you send it, you'll send it as decline, which will just reset this. So that's one thing to note, that even if it didn't make it through DocuSign, you're still filling out this information, which I know sounds a little counterintuitive. But when you click send, you will be presented with the option to decline, which will reset those fields. In this case, we're going to go ahead and select notify vendor, which means we're ready to, that we have executed an agreement. You'll note that the send for is end, and it automatically copies FM accounting. Go ahead and click send. Drops out of the TC's tasks. And if I go back to my professional agreements log, I'm still going to see that there, but now with the status of approved. You'll see total compensation is 0 when you do a 5.3, and that's because we're only using that for the for the design agreements where there might be a condition precedent clause where the total compensation may be different from the contract amount. So just be aware that that will just be 0 for any 5.3, just the contract amount that's important here. Our status is approved, and of course, our attachments are still listed here, but they are now published to the document manager. Okay, now I'm going to create a 5.1. Workflow is very similar, but there's one extra step. There's a lot more to fill out in the form. So where this one took us only 10 minutes, I'll be using majority of the remaining 20 minutes for this 5.1. So again, I'm going to click create, and I'm going to select SC-5.1 design bid build. I'm going to go ahead and open up this form to give me a little bit more use of my available screen. Again, it's telling me what agreement I'm creating up here in the upper left. Very similar to the consultant agreement, we're going to select our vendor. We can search just right in here or use that picker and search from there as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and search for a design company. You'll select your appropriate vendor. Again, it populates the address information, and then we have to enter the firm contact name, title, and email. As the vendors aren't in the system yet, we are not using this picker here. Okay, so I've filled out the design firm information. Now I'll put in the purpose of contract. Again, this is just to keep track of the purpose for this contract. This does not map to a field in the 5.1 agreement itself. So basis of compensation. So this will be what we intend for the designer to do if we don't have full funding. We may not be doing all of this to begin with. I'm going to go ahead and put in 3,000 for pre-design, 4,000 for SD, $5 for DD, 5 for CD. It's just to make sure I've got the proper amounts. I don't want to exceed my funding unless I'm doing a condition precedent clause and I know I'm getting additional funding. I'll put 1,000 in each for the bidding phase and construction administration phase. It does say contract administration. It may appear in the agreement. I know some of the agreements does say construction administration phase, but they are the same here. Okay. I'll put in 1,500 for post construction, and then I'll do 1,000 for reimbursables. So now we'll see that Unifier is adding these all up. It's giving us a fee of 21,500, but we don't have an obligation to pay yet. We haven't defined that. So again, that's in the instance where, so in many instances, these two will match unless you have a condition precedent clause in which the obligation to pay will be less than the total compensation fee. All right, let me. Allow you to unmute. All right, we got some questions here.
Yes. Block 03, the values we're putting there are what comes from the AE's fee proposal. They're either quoting all the phases or they're quoting some of the phases. A condition precedent comes into play if they're quoting all of the phases, but you're only going to award, say, through design development. So that's another topic we can go over. The other item is, let's say we are doing a condition precedent. We have $5,000 for design development, but we're only going to award $2,500. We only have enough money to do 50% design development. I've seen this in a few rare cases. But I think that answers everyone's questions.
So Catherine, this is Lygia. I was just wondering so that the numbers here in the basis of compensation block 3 can be greater than appropriated funding, right?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. We're just recording the fee. Once we record the obligation to pay, to Jess's point, those values can't exceed what we have in budget and funding.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Good clarification.
Yeah. And then anything to note on the CCA? I'm not familiar.
We are trying to, is that the cost sheet, Jessica, that you were asking about? Yes. So this would go to the tip I sent out yesterday or the day before about how to duplicate your tab and pull your cost sheet out to another screen or another part of your screen so you can see those values when you're doing your obligations to pay to help confirm you're not exceeding your budgets. Did that answer that, Jess? You can only nod. I can't hear you, sadly. Oh, sort of. And then Marnie asked about condition precedent. We want to do less of them than we've been doing, but they do come into play probably on large capital projects What I am seeing that's helping on smaller projects is the AE is only quoting, say, pre-design through design development. They're not quoting the rest of it, then we don't need a condition precedent.
How are PMs supposed to know all of this?
How are PMs? If they don't, shame on them. No, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, like,
PMs,
aren't PMs supposed to be filling this out?
yes, this is the PMs. They have the fee proposal. They're reviewing the fee proposal. They can fill this out. They know how much money they're going to award moving forward. I think there's some PMs on the call. Do they have any comments?
Yeah, I have a lot of comments, but I can't talk.
Oh, I can hear you
Yeah,
now.
we can hear you now, Jess.
Yay! Okay, go for it.
I really helpful to actually bring up a proposal and walk people through looking at a
Oh,
proposal, comparing it to the cost code allocation, showing how we're getting these values and entering them in, because there are just some gaps here. You know, I mean, we know that the numbers have to be entered there, but we need to know how to grab that information.
I can probably grab a proposal. It won't be these numbers, but I can grab a proposal and send it to Eric so he can share it.
I mean, that's where I think the true value in this training lies, is updating the exact cost code allocation to a proposal and showing how you're entering this agreement in for a specific proposal and cost code allocation.
Let me see if I have an AE agreement. Ah, I do. Okay, let me email this one. It only has 2 design phases, but this should, I hope, help.
Yeah,
Okay,
Christine, I agree with your comment there, like walking through, entering your budget, cost code allocation based on your proposal, and walking the entire process. Sorry, that's what I was trying to say in the beginning when I couldn't.
I'm glad you're back. So I sent to Eric, which he'll share, an AE, a proposal with 2 design phases. And their proposals should have their fee broken out by those design phases. And you would take the numbers from their proposal and stick them into the correct fields in block 3.
Right, your cost code allocation needs to also reflect that. So my previous comment way at the top was talking about the life cycle of cost code allocation with design. So when we first get a contract, set design budget as sum. And then when we get a proposal from an AE, we go in and allocate that cost code according to the design fee table that's in their proposal. So now our cost code allocation is updated so that we can enter the agreement. And then if there's an amendment again or a proposal from an AE, then we go in again and update that cost code allocation. And that is like the key part to doing a successful amendment.
Correct. So for the budget and funding training, Eric already loaded the costs into the correct fees just to save time. They would have all been lumped under the roll-up code AE fee. And when you receive the proposal, to your point, you go back to cost code allocation, edit it, move the numbers down, and then save it. But you also need to do it to budget. You need to move your budget numbers as well.
Yeah.
If you've baselined your budget, you will need to do a budget transfer.
Yep. So,
okay.
Yeah, those are just so important to, you know, maybe we have to re-review some of those processes because of the overlap, but that is just key to really understanding the agreements.
Okay, so there's no process change that we can do. The reason that we are doing it twice, apparently, you know, it feels like twice in the budget and in the cost code, is because a key driver for Unifier was that we can acknowledge a full budget independent of the amount of money that we're awarded in funding requests. So we
Yeah,
cannot,
apologies.
get out of
I
that.
just meant I just meant yeah, no, I just meant
Okay.
training. So like maybe we have to do something twice, a little bit of overlap to fully understand. Cost code allocation, it feels like is the backbone of almost anything we do in Unifier because it has to be accurate. Otherwise it's going to throw all the contracts off.
Okay, and I just want to make sure people understand it's cost code and budget,
Yeah, no,
2 columns.
sure.
Yeah,
And I'm looping that as that's one and the same at this
okay,
point. But having an accurate cost code allocation in everything we do is crucial to be to execute anything.
right. You can start the agreements without the money in place, but you're not going to get finished without the money in place. So one way to do it too is you can put it in, see what the differences are, and then move the money. So
Yep.
it's whatever works for you best.
But did I understand correctly that we don't have to worry about that at this stage until we get to the obligation to pay place?
No, you can't. You'll get an error. The agreement won't route for final without the money. It's also not going to get past Ron Reed without the money entered into Unifier correctly. So,
But what was the point that Legia was asking about how it could be like in block 3, I think you answered, Catherine, that it could be any amount. And then somewhere else it had to be the amount that was allocated or less.
so block 3 is the fee proposal, just text, just numbers. It's what they're saying I'm going to do all these services for. This can be higher than the amount of money you currently have in your project. Because you might have only, back to the condition preceding, your client may only have funded through design development.
Okay. And so where are you saying that all this cost code allocation has to happen? At what point, if it's not block 3?
Oh, cost code allocation happens on, if Eric wants to show the cost sheet.
Let me save this as a
Sorry,
draft
Eric.
so I can come back to it.
So this happens, but you mean before we even go to do an agreement?
Yes.
While you're doing it, yeah.
Yeah, which
Okay.
is our thoughts of having the project managers do this because they're responsible for the budgets.
Okay.
So Eric will call up this cost sheet.
All right, but then, so when you're saying that you have to go and change the allocation as well as the budget, when is that supposed to happen?
Ideally, to Jess's point, you're going to do that before you send an agreement off to be created.
Yeah, you have to.
You want money in your checking account, is how I like to say it, before I'm going to go hire somebody.
Right.
So Dina, when you do your initial budget for a project, you enter a lump sum for design. That's under the overall AE services cost code. Then when you
Right.
get your proposal, you go in and you break that down into each of the pre-design schematic design phases. Then when that is updated, you can go into your agreement and, pull those allocations. You have to have those exact numbers. Or you can't have it more than based on what you're awarding.
Okay. I'm not exactly understanding. So but we're doing an agreement and we just said that in that block 3, it could be more than.
Block 3 doesn't have an impact on the cost sheet. It is data.
Okay, but aren't you saying I'm using these numbers that I'm putting in block 3 is what I go back to my budget with and allocate based on what the fees are going to be?
Block 3 reflects your proposal from your AE. So say you only have funding up through documents and you're going to you may enter CA and post-construction on your agreement, but it's not going to be in your budget.
Maybe if we
So wait, okay.
pause the conversation to let Eric finish, and then you'll see the costs in the pending column. We haven't got to the point in doing this agreement where the money's actually showing up on the cost sheet.
Well,
And maybe then seeing that will help.
maybe my confusion is when you're saying agreement, you mean the contractor agreement versus,
Any agreement.
okay. Okay,
Let's see if we can get to that point. Eric can show where the money is in the cost sheet, and then that might help clarify. And if not, then we'll go at this again.
Okay, so I saved my professional agreement as a draft here. Okay, so we've gotten through block 3. We still need to define our obligation to pay, which we'll do on the next step. Which in most cases will be the same as the fee proposal, but in instances where you have a condition preceding clause and you're only awarding part of the fee proposal, it will be different. Speed types will populate from your project information and should be current. This is editable if you need to change it. Appropriated funds, this is important to check that this is populated. Again, we run into the instance where folks will allocate their, they'll do their cost code allocation, but they'll just forget that very last step in funding request to get it to that allocated status. If that's done, this will not reflect your current funding amount. And then this amount is what's validated against your obligation to pay to make sure you have enough appropriated funds to cover your obligation to pay. Fixed limit of construction, which we are asking the designer to design to. First in dollar form, so I'm just going to do 200,000 and then click out so I can get my decimals and make sure I'm in the right spot. And then the same thing, but in written format. So 200,000 and 0. Again, we don't need to type dollars. Condition precedent clause, here we're just saying yes or no if that applies. Since most cases won't have a condition precedent clause, for this example, I'm going to go ahead and select no, but I will point out the differences here. When you do select no, the funding appropriated by becomes read-only. You only need to fill that out if the condition precedent clause does apply, because then we're just saying this is when we intend to appropriate the rest of the funding to fund those other phases that may not be awarded. And now we indicate which phases are included or excluded. So in the case where there's no condition precedent clause, all we need to do is indicate which phases are included. The phases excluded, we're really only populating that if there is a condition precedent clause. So in this case, all of the design phases were included. So we're just going to go through here and then put in yes. If you just click in here and type Y, this is kind of the quickest way to do it. You'll only get one option. It's not a yes, no. It's just, is it included? Yes. If it's not included, you would then be able to select no under excluded. You see, as I am selecting yes in these phases as being included, it's automatically making the corresponding phase read only in the phases excluded. If you had a phase that didn't apply, you can just leave that blank. So if construction administration phase didn't apply, we could just leave that blank. In this example, we put that in as part of the fee, so I'm going to go ahead and select yes. firm's proposal date, which can't be a future date. And then of course this will populate as Ron Reed. Now we've told Unifier what phases are included, but we haven't defined our obligation to pay. There's a second step in the workflow for that. So I, as the PM or planner, can send this on. I could also attach the proposal as well. But that will need to get replaced with the signed agreement once we get to the obtained signatures and PO step. So when I hit send, you're going to see the next step is to define obligation to pay. It's just going to come right back to yourself. The reason we're not doing this immediately is Unifier is going to use the workflow to create line items for us, so we don't have to select those cost codes ourselves. It just helps to automate this part of it a little bit. So if I go to my tasks now, I'll have a new task, professional agreements sent for define obligation to pay. I open that up. And accept the task. I'm still going to see all the information on the form that we entered previously. But now if I go to cost line items, the cost line items tab, I'm going to see that Unifier has already populated a cost line item for each of the phases that we indicated as included. So the easiest thing to do here is just to switch to grid mode to enter these amounts. Again, that's kind of that window icon, and it turns it into more of a spreadsheet format. And then I could come in here and enter each of these. Now you'll see they're kind of out of order. One trick is to click on the cost code column to sort these because the cost codes are in ascending order. It then does give you the pre-design, schematic phase, design development. Now ideally you would have your fee proposal up so you'd know how much is required in each phase, or if it matches your basis of compensation. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't note the numbers I put in, so I'm gonna go off of memory, and then if I have to update it, I'll do that. So as I'm entering these, it's keeping track of the total. Remembering that my total is 21,500, so I know that this is not the correct amount. So I'm going to go ahead and double check that. But these are the amounts that will be then awarded. So they need to not exceed what we have in the budget and funding for these cost codes. So I'm going to go ahead and click that blue save button. And sorry, I got to hop back to the 5.1 because I forgot what I put in here. So it looks like I had 3, 4, 5, 5. 115. So I'm going to go back here and correct these amounts. I'm still in grid mode, so I was just able to double click in here and change those. Again, as soon as you change something that hasn't been saved, it shows up in purple and italics. So that's your clue that you've entered something that hasn't been saved. And then anytime you see a blue save button below these tab names, you're always going to want to click that save before you click any other save. And again, these line items, Unifier created for us, so all we needed to do was enter in the amounts, and it did so based on the phases that we marked as included. You also might see an error check. You should never have to click that. It's automatically going to do an error check when you hit save. So there's no need to do that twice. I'm going to go ahead and switch back to form view. I don't need to make any changes here, but now when I go back to my 5.1, the obligation to pay is now populated. And in this case, we don't have a condition precedent clause, so we are awarding the full fee proposal of $21,500. Nothing else to fill out on this form. I'm going to go ahead and hit send. So again, this is the PM or planner. They've created it. They've sent it into workflow, which Unifier then creates the line items for you. The creator gets a task to just fill in the amounts. And then we can send this on to the project coordinator to obtain signatures and PO. So very similar to the consultant agreement in this case. They will generate or create the 5.1 from the Meridian template. And then get the purchase order from Marketplace. If you see that error pop up, it goes away. It never stays up. It just pops up briefly. It still worked fine. You can ignore that. Okay. So as the project coordinator, I now get a task for professional agreements to obtain signatures and PO. I'm going to accept the task. And then we'll see those familiar questions here: data signatures controller, purchase order number, and have you attach the signed completed document. So I'm going to go ahead and attach. And again, if I already have those up in a window, I can just drag and drop them over. The signed completed document that was signed in DocuSign, and the purchase order from Marketplace. And then I'll put in the date of the controller's signature, the purchase order, and then yes, I've attached the signed completed document. And I'll go ahead and hit send. You'll have the same two options here. I can decline. If it didn't make it through DocuSign, somebody declined it, and we needed to make revisions that would go back to the PM or planner. If they needed to update any of the cost information. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and select notify vendor, which just sends it to the end step and notifies FM accounting. And now Unifier will store these attachments into the document management in Unifier. So ideally you would have the appropriate file and file names there, and not just grab something from your desktop like I did. And that is the professional agreement. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute